Hi, my name is Noah Amir Arjamand. I'm a sociologist and the Mark Helmke postdoctoral scholar in global media development and democracy at Indiana University in Bloomington. In this series of talks created for my class Global Fake News in fall 2020, I'm going to walk you through some of the theories about communication, propaganda, objectivity, censorship, and technology that I found most useful for making sense of the media. I want to begin this first lecture with a question. Who controls the media? When we talk about the media, we're talking about the means of communication used to exchange ideas. Media is a plural noun, the plural form of medium, as in something that comes in between, whether in between different people, different groups of people. And a spoken language is a medium, the medium, or one of the media that right now that I'm using to take ideas from inside of my head and transmit them to yours. I'm also using the medium of body language, the medium of video, and a series of digital media that are relaying my speech to you wherever you're watching it. In this series, I'm going to be talking mainly about a specific set of media, that is media that are representations of society, that are saying this is what's happening in the world. But we should keep this more expansive definition of media in mind, this definition that encompasses anything from kind of a shrug to a symphony. Now, when we talk about the media in common parlance, we often mean the news media, journalism, and often this term is prefaced by the word mainstream, that there's a lot of disagreement about what is actually part of the mainstream and who's an outsider. The thinkers I'm going to talk about today are mainly, but not entirely, focused on the mainstream media, whatever that might be, which the different authors are going to call the ruling or dominant or hegemonic news media. The first thinker I want to begin with is Karl Marx, who's known famously as a social theorist, as a father of communism, but who was actually a journalist for much of his life. He lived in the 19th century during a time of dramatic change in both society and in the media. This is the era of industrialization and of mass production in Western Europe, where he lived. And one of the new products being produced and circulated on a massive scale, reaching a large popular audience for the first time, was the newspaper. Newspapers, as we recognize them today, containing a mix of factual stories about important events that have recently occurred and opinion pieces arguing about the big political controversies of the day, really came into being during Marx's lifetime. Marx himself wrote for newspapers in Germany, France, the UK, and the US. He wrote for the New York Daily Tribune in the 1850s and 1860s, though he was more of an opinion and essay writer, of course, not so much a fact-finding, muckraking beat reporter. But anyway, it might seem a bit odd, considering how many years Marx actually worked as a journalist and how famous he is for his revolutionary ideas, that he was very skeptical of the notion that ideas could actually change the world. In terms of his theory of history, his argument about what causes patterns in society and changes over time, Marx was an economic determinist. So as opposed to people who thought that the course of history was determined by divine will, for example, or by the actions of great leaders, or emerged out of conflicts over ideas, Marx believed that the real driving force behind society was the economy, the making, owning, and selling of stuff. According to Marx, you could best explain the social world by looking at relations of production, that is, relationships between workers and people who control their labor and the means of production, like agricultural land, tools, factories, ships that transport goods, things like this. The people in control of the means of production are the ruling class. Who constitutes the ruling class and what that class's collective interests are has changed over time. In Marx's own lifetime, he was witnessing a revolutionary economic change. Previously, the system had been feudal. Production was mostly agricultural, and the aristocracy, who controlled land and in a lot of ways controlled the lives of serfs and peasants who worked their land, were the ruling class. But in the 19th century, with the rise of capitalism and industrialization, the bourgeoisie, the ones who owned the factories and the banks, the ones who paid proletarian workers, factory workers, to produce industrial goods, the bourgeoisie was taking over. They were becoming the ruling class, the ruling elite. And Marx explained the political revolutions of his era in Europe as being the result of class conflict. So as the bourgeoisie gained in economic power relative to the aristocracy, they accordingly demanded political power, demanded a set of rights be put in place that favored them. And the bourgeoisie created political systems that favored their class interests. So according to Marx, liberal democratic revolutions that protected property rights while revoking the privileges of aristocrats, that made it so that different rules didn't apply to you just because your father was a baron, for example. These bourgeois liberal democratic revolutions were actually not so much for the benefit of all humankind, but for the benefit of the bourgeoisie, who had different ways of exploiting the classes below them than the aristocracy. And the bourgeoisie, in creating new political systems, made sure that they defined rights and set the rules in such a way that was compatible with these new forms of exploitation that they were relying on. And of course, the bourgeoisie, they justified their revolutions as being about justice and equality and democracy. They claimed to be working in the interests of all people, but the way they defined all of those terms, like justice and rights and democracy, and the way in practice that they ruled was really based on class interests. It was directed towards serving their interests and maintaining control over the means of production. So Marx is saying that really at the heart of it, there's a base to society consisting of the relations of production and of class structure. And that base is what really determines what different people value, what kind of arguments make sense to them. Really, what we all think has this kind of economic basis at the end of the day. But then resting on top of that base, there's a superstructure of political ideas, of cultural norms and values, which we tend to think of where the action really is. We tend to think of the real conflict in what we're arguing about being at this level of ideas and culture. But really, this whole superstructure is just a kind of facade. But it's an important facade because it's used to trick people into not noticing the base, to trick people into acting against their own real class interests. And that trickery is done through ideas, through the media, through convincing people. So I hope that introduction can help us make sense of an excerpt of Marx's writing. This is from 1845, titled "The Ruling Class and the Ruling Ideas." So Marx writes, "The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, i.e. the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production, so that thereby, generally speaking, the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subject to it. The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships. The dominant material relationships grasped as ideas, hence the relationships which make the one class the ruling class, therefore the ideas of its dominance." So the means of mental production here are the media, which are the means of transmitting ideas. So in Marx's day, what this meant was that the same people, the same class of people who owned the factories, owned the newspapers, or perhaps indirectly controlled the newspapers. And in those newspapers, they published the ruling ideas. When Marx says that those ideas are the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships, what he means is that they're ideas that justify the dominance of the ruling class, that make an economic and political system that benefits the ruling class at others' expense by exploiting others, right? They make these ideas seem natural, the way things are, the way things should be, inevitably will be. So Marx goes on. Each new ruling class which puts itself in the place of one ruling before it is compelled, merely in order to carry through its aim, to represent its interests as the common interest of all members of society. That is, express an ideal form, it has to give its ideas the form of universality and represent them as the only rational, universally valid ones. The class making a revolution appears, from the start, if only because it is opposed to a class, not as a class, but as a representative of the whole of society. It appears as the whole mass of society confronting the one ruling class. So what Marx is arguing here is that ideas themselves are not really the drivers of change, and that claims to be representing the interests of all mankind should be treated with skepticism. In a feudal system, the ruling idea, the ideology of the ruling class, is that the king is a representative of God and that it's best for the whole kingdom if everybody just obeys him. Now, we don't live in a feudal system now and haven't been indoctrinated into royal propaganda our whole lives, so it's kind of obvious to us that such an idea serves the interests of the king, not just society as a whole, even though it's presented that way in royal propaganda, in feudal propaganda. But we do live in a capitalist system, and so from inside that system, it may be a little bit less obvious to us, for example, that the idea that corporations should enjoy the right of free speech in the form of unlimited campaign contributions serves a particular class interest, not some kind of neutral, universal right, the way that people who like that rule, that corporations get unlimited campaign contributions as part of their free speech, would defend as being kind of important in terms of some universal principle. Now, not everybody agrees with this idea, and some do point out that it's an idea that serves the interests of the ruling class, but nonetheless, it's an idea that powerful voices in the government and in the media are able to pass off as possessing a rational, universal kind of validity. The idea of corporate personhood isn't quite as laughable to us as the idea of the divine right of kings. So Marx's prediction was that inevitably the proletariat, the working class, would overthrow the rule of the bourgeoisie, and communism would become the basis for the government, for the economy, and also for culture and media. As an economic determinist, he thought communist revolution was inevitable because of the way that industrial capitalism divided society into workers and capitalists, into these two classes of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. He thought that eventually the workers would have to recognize that they were being exploited, that they would see through the ideas of the ruling class, whether these are ideas about property rights or myths of meritocracy or nationalist ideology that pitted worker against worker instead of against their true class enemies. So this seemed inevitable to Marx because, again, he thought that ideas were kind of superstructural and that the economic base of society eventually would express itself in the ideas of the proletariat. Eventually, the proletariat would recognize their true class enemies, the bourgeoisie, and become a revolutionary class with a new set of revolutionary ideas. Now, in his own career as a journalist, Marx did his best to awaken this revolutionary consciousness, revolutionary fervor, but he did think that it was only a matter of time before the proletariat woke up because of the way that the economy was increasingly being structured. But at least so far, communist ideas have not become the dominant ones in most societies. And even in places like the Soviet Union or China, where they became the official ideology, a lot of workers never quite believed them. They never quite bought into this. So the puzzle, at least for Marxists, the puzzle is why? Why do a lot of working class people cast their votes and otherwise act according to nationalist, pro-capitalist, religious, other kinds of right-wing or centrist ideas, which Marxists say go against their real class interests? Well, non-Marxists have their own answers to that question, but for the next part of this lecture, I want to stick to kind of a line of thinkers who follow on Marx's ideas, try to develop them further, Marx's ideas about the connection between power and the media. I want to explain how later Marxist or Marxian thinkers explained why so many people adopt beliefs that go against their own interests.